Welcome to part 2 of my session with Brian. In this session, we discuss being self-taught, the value of bootcamps, the value of computer science degree, and how we view it with our different backgrounds. We talk about learning Go and using Go in our careers, and we talk about the value of having a community around you as you progress your software engineering career. Hope you enjoy it. You didn't do a computer science degree. I did do. I'm not working in big tech, never have, and you are. So what do you think of the importance of a computer science degree for software engineering in general and for working in big tech?
Yeah, I think that the most successful people that I've seen that are coming in, uh, you know, they seem to do both, and that's tough. Like I think that you can do it without both, right? I obviously believe since I've been in the industry 20 years that you don't have to have a degree because I've done it, you know what I mean? And I'm sure that's true. Now, the entry point is always changing, the bar for entry, It's weird for me, a person with no computer science degree, often to find myself mentoring people who have computer science degrees. You know what I mean? So that's kind of funny, and unexpected. But that being said, the people who seem to do well, in my experience mentoring people, are the ones who they have that level of formal training that helps them to avoid the tar pit I was stuck in with like Googling something that I don't know the term for and never coming up with the answer for hours and hours and days, like that happened to me early in my career. So they tend not to be stuck there. They also have me, so there's an unconscious bias, which is that I can help them stay out of the tar pit. I taught myself with no help, so I didn't even have somebody to point me the right direction. But that being said, uh, yeah, I think that those computer science fundamentals are useful. Something I did as leak code has become a thing later on. It wasn't a thing when I started, and for many years it wasn't the thing. In terms of, yeah, sure, maybe big tech tested people that way many years ago, and they were ahead of the curve, but now it's become more common elsewhere. But when I interviewed, I switched roles at Salesforce from one team to another, and I considered moving away from Salesforce in the middle there. And so this would be roughly 3 years ago before I started on my current team at Salesforce. And so I went out, I interviewed at Netflix, Square, a lot of big tech companies. Those are two of the bigger ones. Amazon, I interviewed at Amazon. And so I did the whole leak code grind thing for a bit, and I had to learn that. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to test your ability to say like, hey, we're going to define some constraints. We're going to give you a sandbox that has, a limited amount of toys in it or tools. And in that environment, can you fit the tool to the problem? So I think that part of leak code is okay, right? There's a lot of problems with leak code, but anyway, you got me started on it because you're asking about big tech versus small tech or whatever you want to call that divide, And so I think that, when I started at Salesforce almost 7 years ago, I did not do a leak code test. I actually came in and I did something else that people don't want to do, which was I built I basically built Facebook Lite in 3 days as a assignment for my job. That was the job interview. That was this final stage of it, right? They weren't giving that to everybody, but the people who made it to the final stage, of which I was one, they got a coding test. And so I built Facebook with comment threading and used GraphQL, and there was like a GraphQL WebSocket layer that nobody else had used on the interview, and I kind of got ahead by figuring that out. And I made it so that if you have two clients open, it'll, I comment on one screen and it shows on the other, right? It's some of the basic like table stakes Facebook functionality. And so that's how I got my job. So when you think about how do you get a job in big tech, there's the answer for me. Granted, other teams have different requirements. My current team, when I interviewed a bunch of people, like I interviewed like 30 people for my current team a year and a half ago ish. And when I did that, we had low level design and high level design. So low level design is the actual detail implementation details about the function. what is the interface, the contract, what does it return, different stuff like that. High level design is more architectural design with boxes that point to things. And, do you understand what Redis is? And do you understand the difference between L1 cache versus, actually reading from disk and that sort of thing, but there was no leak code there, but I wasn't the main person in charge of the whole hiring process. I was one interviewer in the loop. So I don't know if there was a leak code portion, but I don't think so. Even as recently as a year and a half ago, which is right in the middle at Salesforce of this whole, you know, leak code craze or whatever you want to call it. But, I don't know. Those are some thoughts.
Yeah, cool. As you were talking, I was thinking that for me, I think there is a hierarchy. And I think that the best software engineers I know are self-taught. And this is a generalization. It doesn't always hold true. There is a hierarchy in the quality of the software engineers I met. The best ones have been self-taught. And by self-taught, I mean that they've either taught themselves entirely and then they've gone into their career. They've maybe done a degree in a different subject, or maybe not, or maybe they did a degree before computer science existed. There are, below that, the ones that have done a computer science degree, and then below that, people who have come into the industry in other ways. So maybe a boot camp. And again, I'm generalizing broadly. I'm sure there's very different qualities of boot camps. But the main thing I've noticed there is that the people who are self-taught have had a passion, a desire, a curiosity. And again, I fit myself into that in that, I started programming at 9 years old. By the time I went to university at 18 and did a computer science degree, I'd been writing code for 9 years. I already knew various flavors of BASIC, which was quite common there. I'd already been programming in C for several years. I'd already shipped some open source software, shareware as it was called back then in the mid-90s. Now, so I then went to do a degree in computer science as a way of following my hobby and getting a degree, because it views at least in the UK, you had to have a degree by then to go into it. Equally, I met some people in my degree who had never had an interest in computing until somebody in the sixth form in the career advice went, "Oh, you can get paid well doing computer software." And they went, "I want to get paid well." They had no interest in it. They had no passion for it. They had no desire for it. They were looking to do the minimum work possible to get the maximum pay. So those people haven't been good, computer science degree or not. And I feel a little bit that that's happened with boot camps over the last 10 years. There's been a lot of, we see how high salaries are, particularly in the US and big tech. And that's led to a lot of these boot camps springing up and selling people the dream of, come along, do this 6-week training program, and then you'll make $100K US dollars, or you'll make, over here they talk about 50K pounds. And for those of us that have been in the industry for a while, I think most of us know that that's not true. You're not going to come in 6 weeks and suddenly be, landing a big tech job if you've had no passion for the subject, if you haven't done something more than a 6-week minimal effort boot camp. So I think the degree matters less than a lot of people think, and what matters most is that passion, that curiosity, that desire for it. And if you've got that, then the degree adds a bunch of value on top of it, but it's not a requirement.
Yeah, very much agree. Like, I interviewed for a job where the hiring manager was a boot camp grad, and I kind of had a bad experience where it wasn't directly obvious that that person, the hiring manager, was part of the problem, but it just made me think about it when he said that, because when I interviewed, I bumped into what the famously known in our industry brilliant jerk as one interviewer in the loop. And, it was a bad experience for me. And thinking about it now after you're saying that, it's like, well, this person accelerated quite quickly from boot camp to engineer to manager, and perhaps missed an important step along the way with the ability to recognize a brilliant jerk and the danger that they create within a team, So, but that's very indirect. This is not somebody I got much chance to know. I'm being very, nobody knows who I'm talking about. You know what I mean? So a lot of people I've mentored have been coming out of boot camp, and I've noticed this big, like, there was a big bubble effect. I'll never forget 2020. So many friends of mine, 2020, 2022, COVID, lockdowns, and big tech is skyrocketing. Netflix is off the charts because everybody's stuck home watching TV, and it just dropped like a rock, right? Like the whole bubble burst so hard, and we're still in the aftermath from that now, right? All the way in 2025 when we're, recording this episode. And the whole boot camp craze really happened then. And I was, in the mentoring space at that time. And a lot of folks I had came out of that, the boot camp. And it's been, yeah, it's been hard to watch, those people struggle because they were lied to and told that, like, if you do this for 8 weeks and you find, save up enough money to take off work for 2 months so that you can acquire this skill set and you're going to have this high paying job, nothing could be further from the truth, of course, and so anyway, it's been tough. I feel for the people who were sold that lie. It's a painful one, and you know, more expensive than the 10,000 that you spend on the boot camp is the hit to your ego and the just the psychological aspect of recovering from being lied to in that way. I think that's really unfair, and that's a big part of my whole mentoring thing. And I have a lot of mentees, and my whole company is kind of built out of mentees, like we talked about a little bit earlier. And but for everyone that made it, you're right, there were many, many, many more who didn't. And I'll never forget one person really realized, and I think she spent $20,000 on a boot camp, and she was in my mentoring circle. We would just meet every week. I would introduce them to, quote, famous people that work at big tech. You know what I mean? My friends who work for Meta and Apple and Google and, all of that. And I just wanted to give them a chance to meet people who are doing the real work in the industry, let them network and, like, hopefully stand out, maybe give them a chance. And one woman in that group, she spent 20,000 on a boot camp, I think she told me. And I said at one point during a week when we didn't have a guest speaker, right? Like, I had not invited anybody, it was just me and them. I said, I want you guys to know it's okay to not want to do this. Like, you don't have, like, this is hard. There are times when I want to cry myself to sleep because I'm hard on myself, right? There are times when it's like not being able to figure something out is like physically painful for me. And it's like, I know this is possible, but what is wrong with me? Why can't I do this? And it's like, not everybody wants to do that, and you don't have to do that. Like, that's a choice you can make. And so anyway, she just let go of the whole thing because of that comment I think I made, and I felt really good. I felt like I helped somebody. It's better to lose $20,000 than to lose 20 years feeling like a horrible, worthless person. I still struggle to keep my head above water on that, and I've been doing it for 20 years. So, I mean, much less now, and I think overcoming that's been one of the biggest, like, just positive changes in my life over the 20 years of my career. You know what I mean? But that being said, like, it's a very, very real factor, so.
Yeah, and there's also the sunk cost. Somebody's been persuaded by a boot camp to spend $20,000 or £20,000 doing it, and they spent 6 months and can't get a goal. They might be better saying, look, I've been sold a lie here. Let me go back to whatever I was doing before and start earning money again. Carry on with that career, maybe progress it, maybe bring in this new knowledge and help it advance that, rather than falling for the sunk cost fallacy and sticking with something and then maybe being unemployed for a year or two and not finding anything.
Yep, absolutely.
Cool. I think last topic then is we've spent a long time talking about a few things. So we've talked about Go a few times, and we've talked about a different approach to that. And I think, if I'm right, we've both learned Go over the last 2 years. So what's been your approach to learning Go, Brian?
Yeah, and this is back to that blank page syndrome that has that kind of really guides my experience, you know what I mean? Where I just started with a Hello World app, and I asked an LLM questions over and over and over again, and I just learned Go that way. Now, granted, I'm sure there's problems with the idiomatic nature of my code, but I do have like 20 years of experience writing code to help me. so that I can like recognize anti-patterns a little bit more easily, you know what I mean, and that sort of thing. So yeah, like for me, learning Go has just been, it started as my project. It grew into a group project for my mentee group. And then it grew into a company, which is what I'm doing with it now. You know what I mean? And I have people that I'm paying to write Go code for me on my project. And so, but I like Go in the sense that, my experience with Go has been that so at my day job, I am the engineering lead for a team that builds a runtime similar to Vercel. So it's like a competitor for Vercel, Next.js, that kind of thing. It's specific to Salesforce. This is a little bit of a pitch for them, which I mean, I do love the product, but sometimes there's a problem where because I do a lot of mentoring, like developers are my customers. And those partner developers who come along as customers, and then they're sometimes learning React for the first time, and it's like, well, you're not just learning React, you're also learning isomorphic rendering, which I find to be something that, like, 20 years in, it still trips me up, and I'm like, I think I've gotten to the point in my confidence where I'm like, it's not me, it's you. Where I think that the React framework, you know what I mean, actually makes this a little bit hard if you turn it from something that's just front end and you try to make it so that the client and server must mirror each other in a consistent way. That's just a hard mental model to get right. It's hard to execute JavaScript on a server. JavaScript wants like window dot whatever method, and the server doesn't have that, and so this is just like a really boring basic example of something that gets way more complex. And so for me, Go, going back to server side rendering, like when I did WordPress websites and PHP 20 years ago, it's like Go is like PHP on steroids. It's what PHP should have been. You know what I mean? It's like, it's simple. It's a, it's like a dead simple tool that does what it's supposed to do. It doesn't mislead you. It's simple, but PHP has a lot of security vulnerabilities, has a lot of loopholes. In fact, my day job, Meet Near Me, my product, I I have to count. I haven't counted the number of Cloudflare hits for /wp config as bots try to hack my site that's not written in PHP. It's written in Go. You know what I mean? I'm sure anybody who has a site has seen that, right? Like in your like Cloudflare logs. And so I used to spend a lot of time rescuing customers in production because I was a contractor. I didn't have a whole operation, and my clients were small. They paid me $50 a month or whatever it was, which included, I had this whole arrangement with them where it was like, it includes up to non-cumulative 30 minutes of my time a month, because they always need a little bit of technical help, but they weren't the kind of businesses that need regular or frequent ongoing technical help. And so but so many times I had to take something where I finished the project, I had released it to production, it was out in the wild, it got popular, maybe it had a high SEO ranking, and people wanted to steal that SEO juice. So then they figure out a backdoor into WordPress by uploading like a GIF in a way that you never would have guessed, and that has PHP embedded in it, which gets executed on the server and then jacks the redirect so that it points to their site instead, where they're stealing essentially the SEO juice. And so many times I had to go in there and like unhack production sites that were not, this is before infrastructure as code, right? This is before, you write all your code in a deterministic way that you can just redeploy over top of itself and never worry about it, and anyway, I'm I'm like ranting about the good old days of WordPress, but Go for me has been none of that, and all of the simplicity, the directness, the clarity that I feel like that language helped me with in my early career. You know what I mean? And so that's kind of my rough take on it. And nowadays, I would be remiss if I didn't mention like Alpine and HTMX, allowing React-like front-end interactions that don't force you to like reload the page all the time in the old days. We don't want to go quite that far back to the old days. And so Alpine and HTMX have helped me a lot, where still most everything happens in Go. And HTMX is nice for, oh, hey, this is really complex. I want to use types to validate this. I want to be strict about that. And I'll just output an HTML partial that gets injected into the page for something that I want to have a lot of logical density, but live on the server. You know what I mean? So that's kind of my quick take on Go, and it's been a good experience.
What, if anything, was the biggest challenge you faced in learning Go, having come from this JavaScript and PHP background?
I found the syntax to be a little bit surprising. You know what I mean? Sometimes like you have a type, and then there's like an instance of the type that's like the type is it's like curly braces, and then you have an object that's like of the type inside of the curly brace and stuff like I don't know. I'm not. I'm showing right now the fact that I've not been classically trained in Go. You know what I mean? But that being said, I think that the syntax can be a little terse sometimes. And like my friend Vidar uh, prefers Ruby. You know what I mean? And he was talking to me about that. And he thinks Go's ugly. And I think there's merit to that. But at the same time, I want it to be compiled. I want it to be faster than Ruby. You know what I mean? I want it to be, more efficient. I want it to do good at concurrency, which it does. It gives me everything that I want. And like this, the trade-off is like a little bit of inconvenience around, hey, it's not, another one is coming from JavaScript, deeply nested methods like this dot that dot something parens, call this function. And Go has some of that, but with types, sometimes you can drill into something that's invalid or not there, and it can cause like a kernel panic, that kind of thing. Like sometimes the ergonomics feel a little off, but overall, like those are just some like minor things, like I think overall having a compiled language that's like has the benefits of Java. I'm not like a strong Java, like I don't have a lot of Java experience, but most of my Java experience is spent trying to get Maven to work. You know what I mean? And like figure out.
Yeah.
And having this way of compiling that's fast, that avoids a lot of that complex ecosystem overhead. And like I do hot reloading in Go the same way I do in React. My code base has like almost 200,000 lines of code, and it always compiles in 200 milliseconds or something like that. And it like the compiled output's like 35 to 40 megabytes or whatever. So it's good for ephemeral servers, distribution. You can kind of place it in a lot of places, not worry about it taking up too much space, unlike Node modules and Maven dependencies. And it gives you the strictness of a compiler, which JavaScript and the React ecosystem, they come up with that late in the game with TypeScript, which is useful. TypeScript for that kind of static checks and compile validity and all of that. But having a fast compile time, fast runtime, lightweight, not a lot of dependency hell, because Java and JavaScript, ironically, what they share is Maven and NPM, right? Is like they both have this dependency hell. Where the worst thing in JavaScript is the fact that my project looks great and I get this hello world app that somebody carefully strung these 50 dependencies together, and it looks like there's this little tiny tip of this iceberg. You've got 200 lines of code, and underneath you've only got like 5,000 megabytes of code or something like that. And so anyway, but when you when you get a year or 2 year down the road, right, and your dependencies are all rotten, and they're rotting at different speeds, so that they're like some valid, some not, different versions, not compatible with each other. I call that NPM dependency hell, and it's the worst thing about JavaScript. And I think that Java does a little better because it's compiled by design, but it's painful too. And so for me, like, I'm like 18 months into my project, and I bumped the Go version once, nothing changed, nothing broke, and 18 months, that's unheard of in JavaScript land anyway. That's based on my experience.
Yeah, well, that's one of the great benefits of Go is that very, very strict focus on being backward compatible. And the mission with Go is that it will never reach version 2 because version 2 will be a breaking change, and they're never going to do that. I think that's an incredibly bold goal to aim for, and incredibly powerful, having seen the mess of something like Python 2 to Python 3 and the nearly 2 decades that dragged on and created pain.
Yep.
The other thing you mentioned there is that the powerful toolchain that Go has, and the speed of the compiler is fantastic. As you say, I very rarely actually, until I want to ship any Go, actually do a build. Nearly everything I do, I use Go Run.
Yep.
And it's so fast. There's no difference to doing Go Run or invoking Python on a script. I don't really notice it's compiled, where I did a lot of C++ a few decades ago, and there were plenty of times when I knew if I hit compile, I'll go and get lunch. I'll go to the supermarket and buy a sandwich for lunch, or I'll go and put a pot of coffee on because it's going to be building for 5 to 25 minutes, if not longer.
Yep.
Where, I've got Go programs of, 100,000 plus lines of code, and I hit, Go Run and just run it as though it's just another script in Python. It's so fast, and that's fantastic.
I love it.
Makes using it and learning it and iterating just so much easier, doesn't it? Cool. Any favorite Go books then that you've used for learning?
Oh, I was just going to say it's barely perceptible, the difference, between something super fast and non-compiled like JavaScript, where we run front ends all the time in React, right? That have like a node forever, I sound old when I say node forever. That's what we used to use. But the point is, you've got this continual recompile that's fairly lightweight, quick. You feel like you have immediate, changes. You don't wait at all. Yeah, and Go feels like it's like barely perceptible. It's like the tiniest bit slower. You know what I mean? And so yes, sometimes I'll, like hit the window where it's compiling, but it's very, very, very rare. I don't know if I've ever read a programming book. I've bought programming books that I meant to read, but I'm so much a learn by do kind of person that's been my whole experience with the whole LLM and learning from an LLM and and the docs and looking stuff up. But yeah, no, I haven't read any Go books for sure, and I can't remember if I've read any books. No, I read half of one book. Maybe it was about JavaScript 10 years ago. Anyway, something like that.
So maybe that's the difference to the time period of when we got into software engineering. Because when I learned to program in the 80s to the 90s, the internet didn't exist. And I didn't have internet access until I went to university in the second half of the 90s. And even then, it was painfully slow when a lot of things weren't online. So before then, I learned by doing, but to learn how to even learn the compiler, I needed to go and get a book. And actually, even then, I didn't learn C for years because a C compiler was damn expensive in those days. So as a 14-year-old kid, I couldn't afford to buy a C compiler. I didn't get to use C until I was 16 and I had work experience. And I went into a company and they said, well, what are we going to do with you for a week's work experience? I said, I want to learn C. Do you have a C compiler? And they went, yeah, that VAX VMS system there, which is this monstrous system. Well, I'll tell you can do C on that. And here's the big pile of manuals that tell you how to invoke the compiler. So
that's funny.
It was a very different time. Any advice then for somebody that's looking to learn Go?
I guess like I've benefited a lot from the fact that like I can have, there's the whole microservices architecture thing. And, you could do Go microservices because it is lightweight enough for that to be distributed. But I always recommend starting with the monolith and then, break off microservices as you learn about what you need. So, for me, I'm still a monolith, right? I just have one big API gateway all written in Go. Some of it serves HTML partials for HTMX, some of it serves JSON for Alpine, and some of it is just the page rendering layer itself, right? All the routes are managed. There's no React at all in my project, and so for somebody who's learning Go, here's my tip. It's more, this is a library you should use. There's a really cool library that has helped me a lot to be able to do a full stack Go project. It's called Temple, TEMPL. And that library has been incredibly powerful for me. I write like tons of my code in my code base is written in Temple. It allows you to mix Go with HTML in a way that's a lot less painful. So that would be my tip. If you're learning Go, is use Temple, because that'll give you like a basic hello world starting point that's not if you're trying to do front end, it's like for you, you might be writing a CLI tool in Go because you're more back end focused, I'm more front end. It's like, how can you do Go on the front end? It's like use Temple, use Alpine, use HTMX, and then the concept, I posted about this recently on LinkedIn, the concept of using, they call it HADIOAS or whatever. Hypertext as the engine of application state is this principle that HTMX brings. And it says like, hey, the server should be the source of truth. I want to say, yes, definitely that is good. That gets you away from that React isomorphic challenge that I find trips a lot of people up. So I think that's super useful. And so I do use some HTMX, but it has its limitations too. Like, for example, if I have a form where I select a drop down at the top and then it toggles between sort of adaptively showing different parts of the form later on, I don't want a server exchange and a re-render for that. That's actually wasteful in the sense that like there's a lot of code you have to write on the server to do something that doesn't really need to happen on the server. So Alpine will do that for you, right? And then for something where I'm like, hey, go scrape this website, convert it to Markdown, turn those into checkboxes. This is something I actually do on my site. Then present that to the user. That's all HTMX, right? Like it processes all that. We use Go for making sure that all of that is tight from a typing perspective, from a schema perspective, and then you just dump that HTML on the client in the end, and along with a button that is cool. Like the button comes from the server, which is very non-React, but hey, you just have DOM, right? So the button knows about another part of the DOM and it interacts with it. So that's kind of like my Go front end version or take on Go. You know what I mean? That's been my experience. So those are some things to explore.
So I expect we've had very different experiences of Go then, because I have built CLI
Yep.
tools, a clone
Yep.
of Docker's runtime,
Yep.
and the ability to pull a Docker image. I've built a clone of Redis and a clone of Memcached, and a couple of compilers and interpreters. So very, very different projects that I'm building, very, as you say, either CLI tools or system software. So probably a very different experience. Again, I probably using different features of Go. Obviously, building servers, I use a lot more channels and Go routines, which I don't know if you'd be hitting that much with what you've been doing.
I do use a lot of channels and Go routines. Actually, it's been really powerful for that. That's been one of the big wins. Is that I'm able to, instead of going from the server to the client, React render cycle, back to the server, back, we need more data because there's an N+1 call. Obviously, we want to avoid those, but uh, usually you fix an N+1 call by like making the first pass and then grouping or batching as one the second pass, because you often need to get data that's relational or whatever. So now moving all that to the server with Go routines is fast, right? Because it's data center to data center interaction, not client to data center to other data center, back to data center, back to client, and so it's way, way faster and allows me to do blocking server rendering work that typically people tend to want React for, because React will show you an app shell fast, but then it'll make you wait a long time while the loading spinner is there and all of that transpires. So on my side, there's no loading spinner, and I use a lot of Go routines for that kind of like N+1 batching, or like, maybe there's two different tables that I need to do basically a join on or something like that. And because it's between two data centers, I still have services that I use, like database services, and I don't fully own everything in-house, though I'm moving more that direction. But anyway, super good for that kind of like Go routine work. I've found that it's like way faster than the like long round trips that React tends to give you.
So what was your experience then as somebody coming from JavaScript, where you don't have threads or Go routines, to dealing with Go routines and dealing with channels, which are, the idiom's been around for a while, and you could say that, in if we're doing it in C or C++, we might use queues that are thread safe.
Yep. Yep.
But a lot of people haven't come from that background. We'll look at channels and look at Go routines and find it a little bit strange. So did you have any challenges learning about those? Have you got any advice for anybody that's coming across this for the first time that's maybe only done JavaScript so far?
Yeah, such a good question. JavaScript, versus Go routines. So in JavaScript, everybody has the ramp up of understanding asynchronous behavior, and channels and threads are a different. I would say still categorically are asynchronous behavior. I mean, that's just kind of my perspective anyway. But it's like in JavaScript, you have promise.all dot then dot more promises or whatever, right? And it's a little bit like that, but it feels to me nicer. It reminds me more of PHP, which doesn't have threading and concurrency, and it does, but it's not widely used, or maybe it was late. I heard it was later adopted. Like, I don't think it was around when I was writing PHP 20 years ago. But that being said, the async await pattern was a powerful paradigm in JavaScript because you're able to do flow that looks visually the way you expect it to. And that's the hardest part about asynchronous programming, is that you have this chain and you don't know where the end is because you keep calling .then, and it's a little bit convoluted. Whereas and so you end up promise.then ends up being similar to nested if hell, right? And that's a problem. And so having it flattened so that you kind of see the steps. And I find that Go is powerful for that, and so for me, maybe my familiarity with PHP helped me here. I'm not sure, but just think about those, the way that you would write await async code, and you would call await and then async method and then the next thing, so that you're kind of flattening that control flow so that it's not deeply nested in in a way that's hard to follow mentally. I think of Go as being similar with Go routines and the ability to sort of launch threads and channels. But threads are a little bit like recursion. They're not recursion. I know they're not, right? Because if they are recursive, you could have a really big problem, and you better not have that problem. And you could create recursive threads, which would be hilarious and expensive as far as mistakes that you can make. But that being said, it took me forever to understand recursion. And when I finally got it, it was my brain was always trying to follow the looping thread. And something that helped me, maybe it'll help somebody else, was don't think about the looping thread. Just start with a baseline assumption that this repeats forever. And what you're actually designing for is properly covering the multitude of scenarios that guarantee that you have an escape from that loop, right? And so in a similar way, when I think about threading and Go and concurrency and all of that, it's okay, don't make an infinite number of requests in a fan out behavior, right? Be careful about what you do there. But, just know that you're launching all these things together. It's like promise.all, right? You're launching all this behavior, all this functional behavior. I don't know about my wording there, but anyway, that's okay. And so you launch all these threads, and they have a base case. They have an escape hatch, which you need to know. Now, granted, it's not recursive, so you don't really have to have an escape hatch. But it's I'm doing many things at once. I'm resolving those things. Don't think about what all of the threads are doing, right? They need to have consistency around them, because that's where I would get tripped up, is trying to think through many threads of behavior. It's no, just know that there are many clones of a thing. They're all doing something. They're all going to come back, right? And when they do, you'll have all that data. So, that's what I think about when I think about how do you understand Go routines. It's I think of it a little bit like recursion, and how I learned to sort of simplify that with a base case that would help to escape from the loop of doom. The default is you're in the loop of doom, and your design challenge is design your way out of the loop, because if you don't, your computer will melt. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I haven't thought about it that way. That's a very different way of thinking about it. I'll give that some thought. Okay, cool. We have gone on for quite a while now, so
Yeah, sure.
I should let you get back to your day job and or focusing on Meet Near Me. So, any final thoughts to share with the listeners?
I kind of hinted at what I'm doing with Meet Near Me, but part of the reason I built that, just to share a little bit, is hey, I moved a bunch, and when you move and trying to meet new people, that's kind of tough. And so I wanted to create something that made that a little bit easier. How could I find out about events that are happening near me? So that's my little plug for my thing. And I think we talked to you. We're going to put in the show notes a link to that or something like that. So please check it out. It's a big, kind of risky bet that I'm making, in the sense that I am not sure if it will work. We'll see. The hope is that it's a tool that allows people to do a community-based curation without me having to sort of intervene, and that if 10 people all get onto the platform and each put in 5 links, all of a sudden, instead of 5 things that you knew about, you've got 50 different venues that are events happening and that sort of things. But it's been fun because it's given me a lot of purpose by, like we said, by doing something very outside of challenging myself, doing something very outside of my sort of default experience, and moving to Go instead of React. So it's been a great experience. I think that as a software engineer personally, you answered this question. I put out a poll on LinkedIn, and you had said that you're always out of the house, and like for me, that's not true. It's a struggle to get out of the house when I work remote. And so I think it's really, everything has trade-offs. Remote work, I wouldn't trade it for the world. I love remote work because for me, I I get to live in the middle of nowhere. I have mountains within less than an hour in 4 directions, and I love that. That never gets old. That always provides me a lot of like meaning and satisfaction in life. And the challenge is that all my relationships are virtual. And so actually getting face to face with people, you have to squeeze that into the couple hours that you have in the evenings after work when you spend all day in front of a computer. And when I did that poll, I thought it was really interesting because I put like less than 2 hours or less than four as two options. I think 40% of people, and my audience on LinkedIn tends to be software engineers. So probably 40% of software engineers are working remote and get out of the house less than 4 hours a week. You know what I mean? And that is, to me, that's wild. And I think that as AI moves us toward virtualization more, you know what I mean? I think that we need to have proactive tools that help us to preserve that value of in-person connection by making those few hours that you have in the evening more efficient, if that makes sense. Like, because people don't want to go out and like waste time on an event that's not fun. So my goal is to curate those and to be really into personalization. And I use a vector database for that. And, so the idea is like, hey, can we make it so that those, if you're working remote or you just moved and you don't know anybody, or you're visiting London and you've never been there, you can more quickly find like a good index of things so that you can, I think meet more people is the goal, right? I don't want to meet more AIs. I'm not looking forward to robots now that I know a little bit more about how they're going to work because of LLMs. You know what I mean? It used to be great when it was Star Wars, but now that it's like getting closer, I'm like, oh, I think I know where this is going.
So my whole approach to this has been much more low tech.
Yeah.
Get a dog.
Yeah.
That gets me out of the house for an hour a day, walking the dog.
Yeah.
It needs to
Yeah.
exercise. It needs to, do its business.
Yeah.
Gets me out and walking around the local village and town. I meet plenty
Yep.
of people. So
Yeah.
that fixes both of those. Add to that, have kids. I have 3
Yeah.
boys. Take them to all sorts of clubs and social events and educational events and whatever. And yeah, I'd be lucky if I don't spend 2 hours a day out of the house.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's very different for me because, like, I have a dog and I do walk my dog, and I have 5 acres and I live in the middle of nowhere, and I walk the dog around my 5 acres in the middle of nowhere and don't see people. You know what I mean? So just a funny example about how everybody has different context. You know what I mean? But yeah,
Yeah, England's a much smaller country,
yeah,
so even I'm relatively in the countryside. it still means there are other people nearby, so I can walk through the countryside and I'll still see a dozen people each walk.
Well, if you want to see the opposite, you can come to New Mexico. If your wife and you and your wife ever want to come visit, I can show you a vast and empty landscape of nothingness and beautiful mountains and all kinds of things and very few people. In New Mexico, we've got 2 million people, and we're the fifth largest state in the States, which is quite big. So we have like incredibly low population density. So it's super interesting.
That sounds great. I would like that. If I'm over there, Brian, I will be in touch and we'll do that. Do a dog walk and grab a beer or something.
Sounds good.
All right, cool. Thank you very much for your time today then, Brian.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.